title of my presentation is, as you can read, The National Sovereignty and its Subtracting Factor, the case of the private authorities of the Internet. The first step of my speech is divided in 4 parts. The first, object, method, procedure, and choice. Object. My speech will intend to draw your attention to the evolution in time of sovereignty concept. My method will analyze in parallel 2 factors, one of political and the latter of technical nature. Both have been subtracting significant substantial portion from the original content of the state imperium. Procedure, a diachronic dimension, is preferred to aesthetic image because it is suited to follow the evolution of concept of sovereignty. On the political stage, the sovereignty is capable to bend to the emergence of 2 different factors, European Union and the private authorities of Internet. My choice. I will examine on the second factor, the private authorities of the Internet, just to point out the difference between EU and the PAs. They meet on the common terrain of eroding the imperium of the state, but they keep their own feature concerning the nature, respectively public and private, the title, legal and de facto, the counterpart for the state present in case of participation to European political process and absent in case of PAs. Now, a very quick look from the past to the present, and I pose a question. What was the sovereignty at the beginning? In brief, it was the exclusive dominion of the state over its people, settled with a defined geographic space, limits, boundaries, and ideological heritage, where the political line separating a people from its neighbors. In turn, each state was the sole maker of the law. There was no law out of the state, if we want to use an expression of Paolo Grossi. Or if you wanted to remind Teubner, would question whether there could be a constitutionalism beyond the state, a famous sentence of Teubner. But at the moment, we have the erupting of the e-society. And so what happened to all the sovereignty when the e-society entered into the political stage? The traditional feature of the imperium vanished. They began to pale to the point of transforming in something other than what they originally were. The private authorities, if we wanted to use the name of a famous book of Italian author, Bianca, were the principal responsible of the tough erosion of the state sovereignty. The state was obliged to give up fragments of its own powers in favor of private authorities. Let's clarify why we are called them private authorities or private interest government, as I named them in my old book. The reason, they are private subjects that de facto have concentrated in their hands the bundle, the entire set of authority powers, but without a legitimating title to do so. Of course, it's just my point of view in all presentation. Now, is the ancien regime coming back? I wonder if. Why to recall the historical age of ancien regime? Because the private authorities resemble to the Roi Soleil, who concentrated in his person the entire bundle of power. As known, the French Revolution reasonably assigned them to separate public bodies. Why I've said entire bundle? Because the traditional 3 functions, legislative, executive, and judicial ones, are merged and confused into their range. The fundamental constitutional question is, can these private authorities exhibit a title authorizing them to act as a public authority despite the private and contractual genesis, because I wanted to underline to each of you that they have a contractual genesis? My answer is no, for just one reason. They have acquired sine titulo political powers, pretending to behave in compliance with the law. Let's see, of course, very quickly, but then we have a speech on this issue, the regulatory power. The public authorities are self-assuming the regulatory power towards the citizen virtual spaces by means of codes of conduct. What kind of a constitutional issue arise? I think several issues. One, the effective force of the rule. It should be only inter partes due to the contractual nature of the codes. Instead, the codes operate erga omnes, taking a place closer to the law. Second, the binding force. The codes should not have it, but they belong to the droit d'use, as said the French literature, and I quote just Chevalier. They become binding day by day, thanks to the voluntary compliance to the rules, but by the netizens. In other words, the lock-in effect play a key role, as economist scholars say. We have other features that it's important to remind. At number 3, we are before soft law that act as the law. This substitution between these sources breaks the constitutional correspondence of the political power to a politically representative authority. But the public authorities are lacking a popular mandate. I want to underline, are lacking a popular mandate. Thus, political choices should remain out of their competence. Paul Craig said this concept referring to independent authority, European agency, but in my opinion, it can be referred also to independent authorities that they have a private genesis, as I said before. The courts violate the principle of law sources hierarchy because the rules should come only after the prior intervention of the law. But this has been only formally respected. In fact, the Digital Service Act and the Digital Market Act have reproduced the content of these codes. So the codes realize a sophisticated fraud to the hierarchic ledger. Finally, the codes of conduct have been upgraded from extra ordinem to in ordine source, compromising both political accountability and the rule of law. Let's see the other important power, also in this case very quickly because we have a speech on this. Private censorship or the hell of rubbish. Let me draw your attention to a delicate issue. The recent Digital Service 8, in particular Article 9, has entrusted this platform with the power to clean the digital space from the hate speech, fake and misleading news. Putting aside the problems inherent to the procedure, let's reflect together on the nature of this anticipated control of the private authorities. They can conduct a new censorship on our content, which is prohibited in the concrete world. I should say a lot of things, but of course not in this moment. Constitutional question. Is it preferable the risk of an internet downgraded to the hell of rubbish or an internet apparently cleaned but in line with the dominant truth? And I've read a lot of American USA doctrine on this point, on this risk, because it is the risk that we are running. Let's see the quasi-judicial power. The private authorities are also entrusted with a quasi-judicial power, namely the function to resolve in-house a querelle born in its digital space. Let's look closer at the matter. As Facebook has already settled the oversight board, now every big platform must build up its own quasi-judicial body. To clarify, Digital Service Act has imposed this duty to the platform in order to facilitate the voluntary resolution of the dispute. But the Digital Service Act, in Article 21, has not imposed any burden on the citizen. The latter can always and directly apply to the court. In my opinion, the Digital Service Act seems to challenge the decision of private authorities before a court. Also, in this case, I want to pose a constitutional issues. This judge in house, to use an Italian noun, we could say autodichia, self-justice in our system is autodichia, but has a lot of constitutional guarantees that in this case we don't have, will never become a proper judge, with his genetic bias. It is the longa manus of one of the parties, what is the most powerful one. Now, I wanted to redesigning the concept of sovereignty, because at the beginning I've said that this concept is changing. It isn't now what it was at the beginning. Try to say what this concept has begun now. We have seen that happened the old concept of sovereignty. It's time to inquire whether and how a new sovereignty should be built. The state should not withdraw its troops, letting things go their way. If it did so, the self-regulation of private authorities would have an inevitable egoistic outcome. Which could this new public mission? I tried to write, which in my opinion, this public mission could consist in. First, as for rule of conduct, the state should dictate them. For example, draw the thin and very difficult line separating the true from the false news, so that this task is not abandoned to the arbitrary hands of public authorities. As for the rules of fundamental and economic rights, the intertwining between rights imposes to interpret existing law in the light of technological changes, coherent with an evolutionary interpretation of national and European constitutional framework. If you work, my recent paper essays already published in SSRN and then in European public law. Remaining on regulation terrain, the state should also enact rules concerning the stature of public authority, as he has done for other subjects. Basically, the state should anticipate the profile of the structure, rules assuring the democratic internal governance, remedies to the conflict of interest, the separation of division up to the split of ownership. A very actual question. Moving towards the judicial field, the state should create, in my opinion, of course, a new supranational judge, so the netizen could apply to it immediately without running the risk of receiving a discriminatory private resolution. To sum up, in front of a new risk, the public sovereignty could be enriched of completely new powers that now it hasn't, provided that the lawmaker look at new phenomena, in our case the private authorities, with new eyes. The problem is that very often a new phenomenon can be seen by the lawmaker with his look oriented at the back. In this case, I think that is a mistake. In the last slide, there is just essential references, just essential. And I think that I finished my time. Many thanks for your attention. Please, Oreste Pollicini.
Good morning. Thank you very much for being here. As you know, we have two joint panels today that basically have the same constitutional humus that was mentioned by Professor Domenico, and he will then point out in the conclusive remark by Professor Amnon Reichman. You can see both of them over there. In my My basically intervention will not be a presentation. I will be the attempt to let emerge a kind of common context, a common frame in which then all the interesting intervention should be contextualized. The common frame, I think, has been already mentioned before, is related to the what is not a constitutional paradox, but a constitutional matter of fact, meaning private entities that are exercising constitutional function. As you know very well, this is not the first time in the history, not at all. What is new is that such private entities are, first of all, private powers competing with public powers. Secondly, as a business model, the aim to reframe a communities of ideas. You know very well what do I mean by communities of ideas and by digital agora. So this is, it's obvious that in a way it's more challenging for constitutional law. And the great challenge is on the one hand to find new weapons to try to, I would say, face this new challenge, but without betraying the original DNA of constitutionalism. At the end of the day is limiting powers, independently if it's a vertical or horizontal dimension. Having said this, you could ask you, but which are the main elements, which are the main ingredients of such new frame? Jack Balkin, as you know, has tried to, in a way, depict a kind of a triangular shape, no? Private individuals, state, and these new, they are not new at all anymore, gatekeepers. What I would try to suggest you is a quadrangular shape in which you have basically four main ingredients: value as first one, subjects, actors as the second one, space as the third one, and constitutional response as fourth one. Clearly, it's not now the time to discuss or to develop in depth this quadrangular geometry, but what I would like just to share with you are the most important points in my view. As far as the values are concerned, from a transatlantic perspective, you know very well what I'm speaking about: dignity versus equality. You can call no discriminations versus freedom. There is this kind of existential constitutional dilemma between the highest constitutional values in Europe and the highest constitutional value in the United States, especially as far as freedom of speech is concerned. Just to make an example, if you speak with a United States constitutional scholar, you will be very strange. You will have a strange reaction if you ask about the abuse of right. Yes, why? Because the categories of abuse of a right is a European category. This is why in Europe we have to face a fight against disinformation, against hate speech, because we have something that goes beyond the simple exercise of the right, the abuse of the right, which is the constitutional basis for this. It's obvious. It's the principle of dignity. So you know very well which is the difference within the liberal democracy among values. You know very well also, if we move to the second one, meaning the actors, you know very well that you have here to start from the end of the last millennium, when basically there was the need to inject innovation in the new cyberspace. And in order to inject innovation, the idea was, as Giovanni De Gregorio puts in his book, to try to basically work on a digital liberalism approach, meaning leaving these actors free to move as they wish. Then in 20 years, everything changed, as you know. Those actors are not anymore passive at all. They exercise public functions, and there was the need of a reaction from constitutional legal orders. Why? Also because there was the new ingredient, and I'm sure Amnon will speak about this in the final remarks, that is the algorithmic factors. I mean, when automation becomes the rule and the human in the loop becomes human in the corner, then clearly you have a problem for constitutional law. You have especially a problem for those constitutions that put human dignity, human person, as the center, as the road star, as the traveling compass. So this was, in terms of actors, the new challenge that clearly needed to be, in a way, addressed by constitutional legal order. Then you move to space. Space, it's a very complex, I would say, ingredient, because basically the real question about space is those are private space, totally private, but de facto
are where the privileged space in which is exercised freedom of speech. This is not my quotation of Supreme Court of the United States in Buckingham, for example. So what about the metaphor of digital agora? Is a constitutive metaphor or is a descriptive one? As you know very well, metaphors should be taken carefully in the language, especially in the legal language. And this is something very important that should be addressed, because if you look at digital agora as a constitutive metaphor, then you have an important constitutional implication in United States constitutional law. Basically, you are bypassing what is called state action doctrine. And basically what you are saying, it was exactly what Alito said to Kennedy in Buckingham, then you are basically saying that even those private space should respect the public forum doctrine. You know, it's a kind of heretical, it's a kind of blasphemy, but it's a blasphemy that in a way it's trying to find new support, especially in the scholarship in the United States. So you understand how space is important. Space is also very important because it's an ingredient according to which courts can show that cyberspace is not an anarchic space. Thanks to the first case law in the American case law, Calder test, for example. No? You remember, this was exactly an exercise by the court to show that by eradicating jurisdiction, they can prove that internet not only can be regulated, but could be adjudicated by single courts. This was very important. It came first of all from the United States. Then clearly there was this kind of, let's say, exercise by the European Court of Justice in Google, Spain, in which this approach, that means Brussels effect or extraterritorial effects, was blooming. But the first intuition came from the United States. And then we move to the final point. The constitutional response. It's obvious that then you have to distinguish between the legal orders, again, in a transatlantic perspective, because if you think to which might be the United States legal reaction, you know very well that, first of all, it's still a taboo to apply horizontally fundamental rights of the federal bill, especially First Amendment, against private actors. I mean, if you look also the recent judgment of the Supreme Court, there is nothing to do. This is still the rule. So basically, there is a kind of, let's say, of new attempt, for example, to change what it's supposed to be, not again an untouchable regulation, the section 230 of the Community Decency Act. We will, I think that many of you will speak about it. This is very important because it shows how something is changing, is moving also on the other side of the Atlantic from European perspective. And then you basically land to the last European reactions. The last European reaction to this new, I would say, metamorphosis from private actors exercising economic activity to new private powers was a reaction that in a way led to new fragmentation, thanks to the fragmentation led by the judicial actors that basically were in a way creating new categories like active provider, sophisticated provider, passive provider, but not so passive to be basically not responsible. This was what I call a judicial fragmentation. Then there was another kind of fragmentation, the legislative fragmentation, because there were many vertical sectorial legislation, copyright, prevention of terrorism, audiovisual media service, I can continue, that basically Media Freedom Act, that basically we're trying to assess new form of responsibility in specific sectors. And basically you shift from a judicial fragmentation to a legislative fragmentation. In any case, it's jeopardization. In any case, it's a problem for a unitarian approach in constitutional law. Finally, you have exactly what Professor Domenico said, a change of geometry. Not anymore a vertical legislation, but a horizontal one, focusing more on procedural obligation than substantial values, DSA and the Digital Market Act, but with an important footnote. It's not just a procedural fetishism. how it's being called. Clearly, this new dimension of procedural digital constitution is behind constitutional values like dignity, like equality, but at least the difference is that there is a new language, the language of due data process, that is more understandable and more in a way, I would say, even acceptable from the other side of the Atlantic. So the idea is exactly to work
called government as a platform. In fact, following O'Reilly's guidelines, the platform strategies are not limited to the private sector, but are inherent to the digitization process, transforming in this way the government's organization, principles, and modes of action. Just as some big tech try to take advantage of the creative contributions of other companies instead of entering into conflict with them, like Twitter, Apple, or Amazon giving access to other retailers or contributors on their sites while maintaining control of the financial exchange, creating a mix of trust and openness, the same approach is pursued within the state. So the topic of the platform state was based on the imperative of distribution since the 2016 Digital Republic Law. In other words, the state is obliged to make the digital resources it possesses available to social actors. Firstly, by ensuring the widest possible dissemination of the data collecting for exercising its missions and by allowing their reuse for private purposes. Secondly, by giving the public the possibility, through the exploitation and cross-referencing of this data, of better quality services, as well as access to a range of new services. In the French experience, revisiting the theory of collective social intelligence and the social theory of innovation from Negri and Dart, the model of state startups have been developed. These organizations are run by the government for private input to respond to a problem detected while implementing a public policy. Collin and Verdieu repurposed this conception of the multitudes associated with cognitive capitalism, erasing its critical character in order to capture the innovative potential of enterprises associated with digital technology. As a result, interesting experiences such as EtaLab or DataGov have emerged, oriented towards respect of the equity principle and a new level of transparency. In such a context, the government acts like an exchange platform where innovative services are invented and co-produced using public infrastructure as part of the interaction between public and private sector. That endorses the principle of open access by default to all data produced, collected, or received within the scope of a public service mission. In this way, the intersection of data from public and private platforms realized within the scope of application programming interfaces, those called IPAs, enables developers to produce digital services through state startups. So today, in time that I have, I will try to attempt to elaborate on this by analyzing the shortcomings of this experience in France and then the challenges that persist. First of all, the real challenge to turn France into a startup nation lies elsewhere. In fact, it is a question of digital sovereignty. Otherwise, France is condemned to use tools and services to transfer overseas the wealth they generate. The challenges related to government as a platform are enormous. France so far has not responded as expected. Firstly, although the number of digital products launched grows every year, the budget remains modest, and the projects are not always as ambitious as hoped. Currently, rather than a revolution, the main public operators are seeing this approach as a brick in the middle of a huge project. Indeed, the interaction between people, processes, and technologies requires a strategy conceived within an interdepartmental framework, a regulatory and legal framework, quality and accessible content, and appropriate skills. Until now, large-scale innovations, on the contrary, concern services of public interest, but do not correspond to the conception of this open innovation based on open public data platform. So these innovations are no longer driven by startups, but by digital majors, and are not based on open data, but on crowdsourcing the use of data provided by each of the service users. The government today in France is far from being able to stand as the infrastructure that supports them. Digital majors can develop a completely independent offer and attract in their way the creativity of many small entrepreneurs. In this envisaged scenario, the goal of transforming the public sector through disruptive offer of state startups was not achieved. Startups that performed poorly were replaced by state-owned startups. Instead, big tech has been able to develop a completely independent offer, attracting the creativity of a multitude of small entrepreneurs. More than that, however, in particular, one element that has emerged strongly relates to the so-called Uberization of public services by big tech. In this framework, characterized by the hegemony of immaterial production, to quote Negri, the big techs have managed to Uberize even the so-called non-exclusive public goods, and doing all this by stealing a part of the market dedicated to state public services. Of course, not everything state-owned is Uberized today, but little by little, its core is being eaten by the Californian giants, without anyone doing anything about it. This happens through the marginalization of state services that follow different ways and speed depending on the nature and the service produced. Indeed, big tech has a vision longer than the public operators and is more effective and flexible toward the citizens' needs. For example, I can cite the Facebook security sec during terrorist attacks in France. So the system of state startups and governments as a platform has not reached the full extent for what was hoped for. However, this represents an attempt to renew the government's approach to innovation and management within the administration. The pattern of supporting innovation inside society by opening up data, which was at the origin of the government as platform, has been quite well developed, whereas the state startup scenario has not. Nevertheless, when the IPAs were mobilized in a context of competition with digital majors, the result was quite promising, like France Connect. A major positive side in these cases is that the focus on public freedoms is increased. In fact, unlike Facebook Connect or Google Connect, the public button transmits significantly less information about the user when it is activated, and the data is not centralized but remains deposited with its administration. In order to implement the original project of État Plateforme, the government must react and localize itself before others do, especially since the technological solutionism of big tech, with its exaggerated exaltation of efficiency, does not go along with democracy. According to the most recent literature, solutions could lie in ubiquitous distribution, which means making public tools open and creative, creating simple and user-friendly interfaces between citizens and the administration. In practice, this translates into a single counter state where the citizen has single access interlocutor. Thank you.
Dear Marta, also for Marta, I've written one sentence and I hope that I'm understood. So while the state digital platform would maintain a core position in the social game in terms of the resources it drains and the application and the services it authorizes to develop. Many thanks. Then we have a discussion, so every question, every idea, please could you envoy when we open, I hope, a brilliant brainstorm. Now it's time to Laura Grimaldi. Laura Grimaldi is already ready. Okay, is a PhD candidate in constitutional law at the University of Naples Federico II, but she has also carried out a research at the University of Technology in Tallinn, I suppose to escape from me. No, not to escape from me? Okay, now she's writing a book on artificial intelligence, but it's a secret. Your 8 minutes, please.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, many thanks to Professors Domenico, Pollicino, and Rachman for this opportunity. So my speech involves the relationship between technology and politics, which is a trend topic explored by ancient and contemporary doctrine. Ever since the myth of Prometheus, technique has been considered as an essential tool for human beings to acquire power and dominate nature. However, technology is culturally blind, as Schmidt said. It does not tend itself toward a particular goal. On the contrary, it can be as much as a means of oppression as it is a tool to foster collective well-being. In this context of the fourth industrial revolution, artificial intelligence is set to occupy spaces traditionally entrusted to human intervention in both public and private sectors. AI-driven decisions are a challenging field of research. That's because predictive AI systems have a decision-making function. They determine the context of public decisions and radically change the traditional paradigm of public power, which becomes a government by algorithms. Moreover, the relevance of AI is associated with the growth of a few private companies, which hold the indispensable financial and technological means to develop innovative systems and provide them to public authorities. Consequently, big techs concentrate the technical power that has become a new form of sovereignty, since they are able to influence and constrain the exercise of constitutional rights. An urgent need arises to bring technological innovation back within the constitutional framework. So the issue concerns which legal instruments are suitable to deal with the technological challenge. According to some scholars, a new mission for constitutionalism has emerged. Others have argued that this challenge calls for the definition of an innovative constitutional rule of technology as a development of the traditional rule of law. Indeed, theories have arisen in favor of a digital or technological constitutionalism as an evolution of the liberal democratic one. On the opposite side, some authors have believed that digital constitutionalism would be an abuse of domination and that the only constitutionalism needed is one without adjectives. We should say that the goal to extend the coverage of traditional rights to the new technological context can be achieved by means of a broad interpretation of the elastic clauses of the Constitution. As a result, some scholars drew up a catalogue of new rights in order to protect human before the machine. The right to explanation, for example, the right to a human meaningful intervention or human in the loop, the right to algorithmic transparency. Nevertheless, there is a subjective claim that I believe should have priority over the other ones. And yet it is little investigated by doctrine and purely addressed by policy makers nowadays. That is the right to algorithmic education. It has been recently stated that the growth of AI will lead to a new form of digital divide, the so-called AI divide. It will be a new factor of digital exclusion, with adverse effects on the employment, education, health, social service, economic development of digitally excluded people. Therefore, providing compulsory education on AI shall be considered as a fundamental right of an AI society, instrumental to the exercise of other guarantees. In this regard, a right to education on AI should not be considered as a new right. For example, the Italian Constitution already provides a constitutional ground for the promotion of scientific and technological research on the one hand, and to the right to education on the other one. Nevertheless, the effective enforcement of the right to algorithmic education requires a concrete and continuous activity of implementation by public authorities. So the proactive role of the public decision-making invested by democratic legitimacy is paramount. For example, it is worthy of note the initiative of the Finnish presidency of the Council of the European Union, which has made accessible the online course Elements of AI, created by the University of Helsinki, to disseminate basic knowledge about what AI is and how it can affect multiple aspects of our daily lives and of our society. In conclusion, artificial intelligence remains a human product, however revolutionary it may be. It is up to the human beings to govern AI and to political decision makers to direct technology innovation to the service of people and the collective well-being. This is because, as Aristotle stated, technology is the science of quantity. Politics, on the other hand, is the art of making choices. So without politics, technology cannot know where to go. Many thanks for your attention.
No, it's okay.
It's enough. Thank you.
Many thanks, Laura. Also for Laura, I wrote a sentence. The resolution of the above mentioned issues for Laura requires the intervention of the public decision maker invested by democratic legitimacy. Many thanks also for Laura. Now we have Lars Verlechner. I suppose that, of course, I wrong your surname. Is it correct, your surname?
Yes, Verlechner.
Verlechner. Fine. Miracle. Come here, Lars, please. Lars is a professor of public law, in particular constitutional law, constitutional theory at the University of Bremen in Germany. He also studied at the University Panthéon-Assas, Paris, and also he served as a law clerk at the Federal Constitutional Court of Germany. Now is with us on this issue, the constitution of online platform between national and international, public and private stage and contract. Please.
So, good morning, everybody. The constitution of online platforms is the topic of my presentation, and I cannot.
Mouse. I don't know why.
Okay. And the aim of my presentation is to develop a notion of constitutionalism for online platforms such as Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and so on. Of course, I can only give a rough outline here, and I will proceed in two steps. The first step is analytical, so to more closely define what actually is the constitutional issue here. And then the second step will be the normative answer, so the attempt of giving a solution and answer to this question frame. Now, turning to the first question, the analytical one, the constitutional issue. What is the constitutional issue of online platforms? So if we have a closer look at them, we see that they actually break the classical dichotomies of legal thinking fixated on the nation state. On the one hand, they are neither state actors nor international organizations. In this capacity, they may not enact rules that are generally binding. On the other hand, however, they create quasi-public fora of communication for which they assume a gatekeeper function. So users who want to adhere to these virtual communities have to accept the terms and conditions or not. And in this sense, the numerous bilateral contracts are geared towards a common aim and thus form a network of contracts, which indirectly creates a collective form of order. And this new form of normative ordering is relatively independent from national and international law, especially because these new forms of order have an extraordinary capacity of enforcement. So they may delete individual statements or entire accounts electronically. So once a commentator said, this is the electronic equivalent of the death penalty. So no, you no longer exist in this world. And the question becomes even more complicated if we acknowledge that much of the regulation going on there is no longer conventional, but by algorithms. That is, it takes the form of technical code and thus influences behavior indirectly and perhaps even unnoticed. And so we may discuss whether this is a new form of law. In any case, it's similarly effective. Now, turning to the second question, the normative answer. From this peculiar status of online platforms arises a problem of legitimacy that in my approach may be remedied by a new approach to the horizontal effect of fundamental rights. In this understanding, fundamental rights, on the one hand, are the foundation of these new normative orders. They protect them because they foster individual communication and information in these new online worlds. But on the other hand, they also serve as a limitation to these new forms of legal ordering, so protecting opposing liberties of infringement and also providing for equal protection in these online communities because they assume a monopoly position in regulating issue areas which are fundamental for certain forms of freedom, especially freedom of communication and information. Now, how to operationalize, implement such an understanding of constitutional rights? On the one hand, these constitutional standards may evolve internally within these new online communities. And we see instances of that. So Twitter, for example, has amended its policies so as to include exclusions to its cancellation policy for statements which are in the public interest. Facebook has instituted this new oversight board as a quasi-judicial organ. We've heard about that. But as long as this auto-constitutionalization, as Teubner would call it, does not succeed, these new forms of legal ordering would have to be complemented by the national and international legal orders. So in the same way as we have complementarity functions between European Union law and national legal orders, for example. So as long as they do not provide for an adequate protection of fundamental rights, national legal orders would have to step in. And this even works in legal orders which do not know of a horizontal effect of fundamental rights. So in this case, private law might step in. So antitrust and competition law, or even rules of common law, may be used in order to constitutionalize these legal orders. And then the most difficult question is, of course, how to bring to bear constitutional standards on technical forms of algorithms and so on. This is, of course, the most difficult questions. Here, it's clear that technical code cannot be regulated directly by the law, but we would have to find some ways for somehow implementing, transplanting legal standards into the technical code. And this is, of course, an interdisciplinary endeavor between technicians, information scientists, and lawyers. What should become clear, however, is, and this is my conclusion, that the legitimacy of the law of online communication may only be guaranteed through some sort of horizontal coordination between the various legal orders, so national, international, transnational, and constitutional standards may thus be generated in a process of mutual recognition and contestation. So any competent legal authority may take a binding decision, but none of them has the last word. So rather we see a process of recognition and in this sense, the dichotomy between government and opposition that forms the core of democracy within the nation state might somewhat be transplanted and reconstructed with regard to online communication. Many thanks.
Of course, in the merit, but also because it's per 1 minute. We have 9 minutes of Lars. Many thanks. Okay, also for Lars, just a sentence that I want to highlight, just for me. He talked about an adequate reconfiguration of the modern constitutionalism in the current context. Okay, and then is for our briefing. Now we have another lady, please, Fulvia Abbondante. Fulvia Abbondante is associate professor in public law, University of Naples, Federico II. Now she teaches information and communication law. She has written 2 monographies. The first is on the gender equality, but I suppose that in our group gender equality is completely realized. And another is on secession. Okay, your 8 minutes. Bye.
Thank you very much all, and I am very grateful, Professoressa Domenico, Professor Pollicino, and Professor Rackman to give me the opportunity and the chance of speaking in this important and lively international panel. My speech is focused on the relationship between Facebook Oversight Board and the SA recent approval. The birth of Facebook Independent Oversight Board poses many issues for law scholars. This is the first example of a private Supreme Court inside a big corporation, able to engrave on fundamental rights of the users, above all freedom of speech. The emergence of forms of private justice is not entirely new in the evolution of the contemporary legal landscape. The need for increasing lapid forms of alternative despot resolution has led to a substantial proliferation of private bodies, which therefore, especially in the commercial field, replace the judge in the decision. With the rise of social platform and the spread of risks associated with usage of the network, providers have identified self-regulation rule able to prevent the dissemination of the illicit content and to remove or block those contents. To verify that, thank you, Giovanna, that the contents uploaded by the users did not contravene the rules internal or contained in national and supranational law, The moderation of the content can take place ex ante, before it is published, or ex post, starting from its publication. The removal can take place in reactive way, based on flags, or proactive way, by searching for content. Quoted Santoriello. Time by time, a large workforce and artificial intelligence were employed by platform to consider each decision more accurately. For example, by looking at the context and the intended meaning of a particular post. Thank you. Achieving a greater degree of consistency, quoted Clonic. However, neither the human nor the technological moderation system can fully solve the issue about fair decision when referring to the contents published on the platform. And as some scholars point out, above all by European regulator, social networks have seen the spread of hard and soft law rules in the control of circulation of illicit content, so that platforms are the longa-manos of the states, which delegate public power to private actors. Professor Pollicino, Professor De Gregorio, and Balkin Woods. But the oversight board of Facebook is a part of Facebook content moderation system. Some scholars define OB as a semi-independent self-regulatory body, Floridi, while other transnational hybrid adjudication body, Guladi. Other authors consider that OB is an internal complaint handling system. The presence of the oversight board meets the need to check any possible mistakes committed by human content moderation or algorithm that implies a limitation of freedom of speech. The choice of this appellate procedure guarantees a high level of expertise able to verify the correctness of Facebook about the removal or blocking a specific content or account. On the other hand, the lack of independence of the board is evident. As a matter of fact, for the governance of B is composed the Oversight Board Trust, Facebook Oversight Board LLC, Facebook Oversight Board Co-Chairs, Facebook Oversight Board members. The first was created to guarantee the financial independence of the board from the company, but the resources of the trust are totally granted by the Meta, who appoint the member of the trust too. Recently, the approval of Digital Service Act, a new regulation that modifies Directive 2003/31, legitimates the existence into the platforms of internal private adjudication, according to Article 20. The Article 21.1 of the SA, at the first sight, gives a chance to users to protect their freedom of expression and reduce the possibility of censorship and collateral censorship of the platform through the introduction of ADR, before Court certificate body, so that the DSA seems to shift the problem from a private internal adjudication body to another external private adjudication body. But reading carefully the Article 21.1.3, the uploader seems to have the opportunity to choose among internal remedy, out-of-court procedure, a judicial decision at any stage, according to 59 Considerandum 2. But what is not an option to issue the internal complaint remedies before and to choose after between out-of-court decision and judiciary decision alternatively, or it is possible to start appeal indifferently before one of them. Moreover, according to Article 21.2.3, it is totally useless to challenge the decision on content moderation before out-court body if the settlement of the certified body is not binding for the parties, so that the uploader or platform to solve definitively the dispute can initiate a judgment before the court. In this case, there would be an excessive lengthening of times and of the expenses, above all for the platforms, but for users too, with an excessive restriction of right of defense and freedom of expression. Probably the best solution should have been to introduce different rules in each member state to achieve streamlined and fast processes. Another possibility is to create a new special public jurisdiction in every member state to decide on removing or blocking the content by platforms, quoted the Minico. The only certain is that the botched solution of the SA creates more problem than the workable answer. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks also to Fulvia Abbondante. Just this sentence for Fulvia. Fulvia underlined us that we are running the risk of delegating to private actor quasi-regulatory powers, and they permit to add also quasi-judicial powers. Now it's the time to Giacomo Giorgini Pignatiello, please.
No, Giovanni De Gregorio.
After. Okay. Giovanni, is it with us? You want to come up? Please. Sure. And after Giovanni, we can
like to.
Okay. After Giovanni, we can give the point.
Giovanni, I'd like to introduce you.
Mm-hmm. So the final speaker before the break is Giovanni De Gregorio. He's a chair in law and technology, very new. Congratulations, appointed by growing very well Católica Global School of Law with Miguel Maduro and other friends in Lisbona. He was, I had the privilege to supervise his PhD. His PhD, and his research interest deals clearly with constitutional law, human rights, international law, privacy, data protection, and his new book of 2022, published by Cambridge University Press, is has the interesting title, very, very timing, Reframing Rights and Power in the Algorithm Society, Digital Constitution in Europe. Is the first book about digital constitution, maybe the second, depends on how you see my first book that starts with judicial protection, fundamental rights, land the second part on digital constitutionalism, and Joanne has been so great to develop the idea. By the way, you have the flyer of my book, just a little, very embarrassing self-promotion if you are interested. Please, Giovanni. And then the break, and then please come back all, and if it's possible, even more.
Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction. And of course, it's nice to be here. It would be like a short presentation. What we're trying to do is just, of course, this presentation will focus about the future of online speech regulation from a transatlantic approach. This is a kind of a work coming from the collaboration that I'm having with Francisco de Abreu Duarte, that actually we're trying to write this paper. It's been a while nowadays, but we are still waiting for some decisions coming up. That's why, we're still on hold on this paper. But let me say why actually we decided this paper. And the title of this paper, usually, it's about importing America, exporting Europe, So this is actually the subject matter of what we are talking about. And the presentation that I'm going to do is just about divided in these two steps. It could be also divided in 4 steps, but let's imagine there are these 2 steps about importing America, exporting Europe in online speech regulation. Basically, what we have seen in terms of methodology, even before to start about and talking with you about what is the story behind this paper, the methodology of this paper actually tried to focus as a mix between trying to approach the new concept of digital constitutionalism, a comparative constitutional law, and try to understand also the consequences sometimes of, bad choices of legal transplants that are made, also driven by political reasons that are not just, of course, constitutional legal reasons. So basically, the story of this paper is actually that, I mean, we've seen 20 years ago, a lot of enthusiasm about narratives and scholars saying, we have the internet, we have this new space, we want actually to ensure the development of digital services, and this is very important for us, but also for Europe, for the internal market, and now we call it the digital single market. And this decision actually has driven the idea of we need to ensure a framework where we can provide and foster the development of new digital services. First point, first constitutional point. And this actually has led, in a certain sense, to look at the US approach. 1996 has been mentioned already by Professor Policino before, as a beacon to drive, the digital transition already when the internet was launched at the end of the 90s. And that's actually was been the first point. But it's not only been the first point, because there is at least a second point why a framework of digital liberties was so convenient for public actors. Why? The problem of enforcement. If you read the debate 20 years ago, there was a big issue about state internet enforcement, and there is still the same issue nowadays. It's about, of course, that the public actors have also incentives, sometimes not to regulate the private sector. Sorry, for many reasons. Because when you regulate, you expose yourself to accountability, and then when you regulate, of course, it means how you regulate the space. And it means actually that you are stepping into enforcement, and this raises a lot of constitutional questions in terms of surveillance, accountability, protection of human rights, fundamental rights, and so forth. So it was quite convenient to use private sector as enforcers of online speech regulation. This is actually why we experience the rise of self-regulation, code of conduct, streaming, of course, and now we have community guidelines and all this stuff, But actually, we have seen that actually this system has been, in a certain sense, put in question, especially in the European framework, through the process also of the constitutionalization of the European Union. We've seen also how, and this is actually the book that Teresa was mentioning before, it's about the book of judicial protection of fundamental rights. We've seen how courts have helped, have guided the transition from a framework of digital liberty to a democratic strategy in Europe. When we talk about procedural in the Digital Service Act, we're talking something about that has been very much triggered by the role of courts in the aftermath of the adoption of the Lisbon Treaty with the Charter. So the idea of importing American values, importing constitutional laws and values, the First Amendment from the US law, has been started to be challenged in Europe. Because, of course, the idea of the protection of fundamental rights and the idea, the roots of the European constitutionalism have started actually to emerge as a standard for thinking about the role of the digital society and the digital age. And what we've seen is that now actually we are starting to move to an approach that now we're talking about exporting Europe in a certain sense. It's not about a more importing US standards. What we are trying to do in a certain sense is exporting these constitutional values. So it's not about anymore importing Europe in a certain sense. And this is actually the last point of our paper. But about exporting Europe, what is important is that what we are seeing is not only driving new legislation, procedural law, and whatever platform regulation. What we are also seeing is that actually extending these values on a global scale. And this does not just come from the law. It's not just the extraterritoriality approach, the Brussels effect, whatever. It's also because sometimes, and this again try and find its roots in political economy, sometimes businesses and transnational businesses find it more convenient, much more convenient, to look at one standard. That if you can comply with one standard on a global scale, that is the best that you can get on a global scale. Probably you will adapt also your entire business framework of content moderation also to the global scale, no matter what, because you play safe. You just follow one standard, you are okay. And this actually drives a lot about the boundaries of the Brussels effect, even beyond the territorial scope of legislation, because there are also, these processes are also driven by the private sector that finds like the GDPR, the Digital Service Act as standards. But there is at least one point to stress, that it's very, very important, because we usually think about extraterritoriality, and I wrote this in the last chapter of my book. We usually think about extraterritoriality, the Brussels effect, the importance of the European standards on a global scale. Yes, but there is also a counter-argument in this case, and there is also a counter-trend in this case. What we're seeing, for example, with the Artificial Intelligence Act, or with other pieces of legislation, and what the European Union is doing when using its narrative of digital sovereignty, is also using a kind of form of constitutional protections, and it's closing its boundaries, saying, you want to come and offer your services or products to the EU, you should what does it mean if we export to Europe, especially in the US framework, what are actually the result of this potential legal transplant? Also the exportation of European constitutional values in the US framework. And what does it mean importing Europe? What would be the consequences? The consequences are still to look. Probably there is a lot of distance between the constitutional approaches still, they are very, very different, they're very distant to each other. We have seen some kind of interactions, even informal at the political level, but what we are waiting for are two decisions of the Supreme Court that will take a path or actually a position on not only Section 230, but generally speaking on platform governance and content moderation. We'll see what's going to happen. And this will be actually the first answer to see how the models will interact to each other in the next years. But the idea of proceduralism, it's really exporting, not only because it's relevant for platforms, not only because it's relevant for the EU, but it's particularly relevant for the private sector. Since we know that very well that in the US constitutional law, very much everything comes from the bottom, a kind of constitutionalization probably could come from the bottom, and procedural law could also be important in America. So this is actually the main argument of our paper. Thank you so much for listening, and of course we'll have plenty of time to the break to talk about that. Thank you so much.
And so we have the break. Please don't escape. Just 15 minutes, okay? We wait for you here, 15 minutes, and so we can go. Many thanks.
Questo più nulla.
7 e 11 è...
Visto.
Ok, io...
Abbiamo la foto da fare fuori.
30 minuti il coffee break.
Vabbè, abbiamo detto che ci un po' prima, 25, ok?
Ok. Va bene. No, era per dirlo a Melissa.
Melissa, sì. Dille che al 25 ci si rivede qua. Allora,
What are the limits for the law? What do we expect as academics? So in this provocative opportunity, I'd like that we can think about some precautionary measures, approach, strategies to go beyond the theoretical approach, as we were invited by our colleagues on our opening remarks of this annual meeting of the International Constitutional Law Association. And we have to discuss how we can counteract the cybercrime asymmetrically. But why asymmetrically? What does mean, Francesca? The freedom of expression and democracy. Does the law itself can give us the substantive meaning what democracy is for all of us, or we should just keep aside with the professor from Brazil, Flores, when he says, and I quote, racism in Brazil can be a very proof to indicate to us what is our democracy. It's not only the law, it's social aspects, it's economical, and it's underneath of all politics, which is the choices of the people. And we have to decide how to counteract, because we are creating metaphors when we just stay at a glance thinking we should apply for the internet world our rules of our real lives. I think we should not pose this question, because as I quote here my dear colleague, and she said, Laura, the artificial intelligence is power acquirement, blind, tool collecting, predictable, and summarize it, scholarly speaking, and I praise her for that. It's a human product. But I would like to say that algorithms does not govern the society. We are not governed by algorithms. The government is governing us through it. So who has the last word about which kind of program for? I will not read all of them. I'm gonna leave the material with you, and I'd like to answer, to receive your comments, your criticism, that I can improve this, this paper. But I, as a prosecutor, I have to ask myself every day, how we prosecutors, the prosecutor office, give responses including engagement with the private sector and information technology solutions. And I quote Giovanni, who I would like to congratulate his thoughts shared with us, because we have to establish, beyond transparency, we have to state clearly accountable institutional design, who we are to charge for this lack of compromise with our democracy. We are talking as constitutionalists about a digital constitution, but we cannot forget that the fundamental law is entitled, and we expect that it can rule any effect derived from human man action. Having said that, and have quoted that Professor Laura words, this is a human product. So I think we have to decide how to improve our society. We have collectively to decide what kind of expectations legitimately we are to enforce. Otherwise, we're gonna remain in this kind of game of metaphorical figures, always searching for the guilties and never having enough response to comprise our expectations about the meaning of the law. And 2 minutes, thank you very much. Objectively speaking, my research, I try to discuss and scrutinize what way aspects of the fourth industrial revolution impacts on national identities, discussing interlinkage between freedom of expression, the rule of law, geopolitical strategies, because we know as countries, representatives, countries, there's no friendship among them. We can be friends among ourselves, but governments, they are not friends at all. Governments, they have interests, and we have to ask to ourselves, who theoretically, academically, we are serving to? We are serving to humankind with a shared human concern about our human happiness for all of us, or we are just expressing our concerns about our governments. This is a disruptive social context, of course. We don't have any disagreement about that. And I could also quote Marta Aurino when she said, very on the spot, France does not correspond. And what does it mean for us, for our countries? Mutual legal correspondence in the level of international law, when we talk about constitutional provisions, the constitutional, transnational constitutional dialogue. What are expectations when I speak another language and I pretend to speak in Portuguese, but in English, but we don't speak the same language, meaning we are playing, again, metaphorically, in order to not have acquainted and enforcement with the law. And finally, I'd like to thank all of you. I'd like to ask you that we can think about in our concerns and research the mechanism of the Budapest Convention, the second protocol, additional protocol, because how we can fight the hate speech. There is a core word I haven't listened yet here, and I'd like that we can think about. The proof gathering against internet hate speech crime is tiny. If we have too much bureaucracy, I'm sorry, our expectations about the efficiency of the law is just vanished in the air. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Gustavo, also for your powerful presentation, for combining the theoretical approach with the more pragmatic and, let's say, functional, very important role that you are playing as a public prosecutor. This is something very important for us. Now we move to the next speaker, and I have the pleasure to introduce Luz Orozco-Ivila. She is a PhD candidate at the University of Oxford and holds the LLM from Columbia Law School. Her research lies at the intersection between emerging technology and fundamental rights, so very, very accurate. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much, Francesca. Do you think you can help me put down so I can read? Okay. Thank you so much. So how can I, or I'll tell you, or how can
So you want me to?
No, I mean I can switch if you just tell me. Okay. Okay.
With the mouse if you prefer.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you very much, professors, colleagues. I want to kick off with this powerful image that we are all probably familiar with. This is literally the American Capitol on fire. There are many reasons that led to this landmark event, but there is one that is particularly relevant for our workshop. The rising powers of these guys. The rising power of online service providers, particularly social media platforms, and the appropriate and proportional response from constitutional law. Among the many questions we can pose regarding this enormous private power over the public conversation is what should be the normative source of the rules governing online content. In an obvious oversimplification, we can say that it could be that companies themselves who should decide their own rules. Cyber optimists would defend that this is the only way to keep an internet free from undue intervention from the state. However, we have seen where this optimism has taken us. The second one is that the state should establish these rules. This is obviously, again, an oversimplification, since states have already some rules in place. Think about defamation, privacy rules, as it happens offline. But the point here refers to rules regarding liability for digital intermediaries. And there's a third approach. The normative source should be international human rights law, as David Kaye, the former UN Rapporteur of Freedom of Expression, has suggested. After all, and this might sound appealing, is that it provides a universally agreed set of values and a common language across borders. Well, I would say that this is actually a false trilemma. Why is that the case? Well, at the end, both the state regulation and international human rights law depend on online service providers to actually apply and enforce these rules. Due to technical and political reasons in the case of the state, and due to the voluntary character of international human rights law regarding private actors, both of them incentivize systems of self-regulation. The result is that social media platforms are developing a complex transnational private regimes to moderate content. This, we can divide it very simply by formal rules like codes of conduct, terms of service, community standards, but also material rules, such as internal policies and computational tools. Scholars have pointed out these enormous constitutional implications. They allow for strong interference on users' rights. They imply a concentration of power on single decision makers that create, apply, and enforce these rules. and they lack democratic legitimacy since users normally are not involved nor represented in the creation of norms. In other words, we have a constitutional problem. So digital constitutionalism has stepped in, offering an angle very much needed on a scholarship dominated by regulation, media law, and intellectual property. However, as Eduardo Celeste rightly points out, there is no unitary picture of the concept of digital constitutionalism, nor agreement on whether it aims to limit private or public power, or both. Civil society through the proposals of bills of rights or company themselves. Now, the great majority of digital constitutionalists have cited the work of Gunther Tornel to some degree, suggesting that they share the idea that the constitutionalization of the digital sphere involves multiple actors, as stressed by systems theory, and multiple sources, as acknowledged by legal pluralism. However, this perspective comes with a warning, I must say. If we are only referring to the project of articulating constitutional values in the digital sphere, or an ideology, as Celeste points out, it might get too broad too soon, which begs the question on how we can move beyond constitutional discourse. So what do I mean by the effective constitutionalization of the digital sphere? If digital constitutionalism intends to have any explanatory power of what we are witnessing on the digital environments and serve as an effective roadmap that should guide further developments, it needs to identify its theoretical substrate, the minimum core that distinguishes it from only using constitutional terminology for common problems. Following Angelo Golia and Teubner himself, I identified this core as proposing essentially the theoretical empirical existence of transnational constitutional norms outside the state structure. Instead of relying on command and control regulation, the idea is to generate external pressures that can steer private actors towards the adoption of constitutional values in their daily practices. With this theoretical substrate, my focus is on the interaction between two specific regulatory actors, courts and social media platforms. In other words, how courts may foster or irritate, in Teubnerian account, the process of constitutionalization of social media platforms. And here is Lars. I think I pretty much agree with Professor Villachnacht's presentation. So, since I focus on courts, I must say that in the existing academic literature, there is a lot of skepticism about the capacity or utility of judges in a massively intermediated digital sphere. Nicolas Susor, for instance, predicts that courts will not have a primary role in the future of the internet, considering how expensive and slow they are to make a significant impact, given the sheer amount of online publications. Evelyn Dweck points out that the systemic nature of content moderation requires proactive and ex-ante regulation much more than judicial review. Admittedly, no judicial system is prepared for the scale of internet. More importantly, courts face great limitations regarding legitimacy and competence. They are tied to the individual claims before them on the rigid structure, procedures, and dependent on well-resourced litigation. However, judges shape reality not only through individual cases, but mostly through the problems under their jurisdiction. So I would like you to consider very quickly these examples. So courts have generated a counterphobic reaction from legislatures. This is the case of CompuServe and Prodigy cases that led to Section 230 of the US Communications Decency Act, or Brazil's Marco Civil de Internet. Courts have also influenced the articulation of new rights and obligations. Think about the most obvious example is the right to be forgotten in the Google Spain case, but think also about the German Federal Constitutional Court in the case of Dritte Weg versus Facebook, which acknowledged the market power on of the platform during elections and ordered Facebook to reinstate a previously suspended account. Courts have also influenced the setting of procedural standards. Consider the German case of Facebook Terms of Service, where the Federal Court of Justice requires specific procedural guarantees to be established by the platform when deleting posts or blocking accounts. And finally, there's also substantial standards, such as the Belén Rodríguez case, where the Argentinian Supreme Court held that search engines could not be liable for illegal content upon notification unless a judge had adjudicated the material as unlawful. Yeah, I'm running out of time. So my second claim, I want to say that this is particularly relevant in certain contexts. And I must say that, in my view, this will be particularly relevant in Latin America, particularly in Colombia, Argentina, and Mexico. And this is just, enunciating. You can see why I believe this is the case. So my 2 cents is that, very briefly, with all their limitations, courts have triggered digital policy, and they will continue to do so in the future. And the judicial role will be of particular relevance in Latin America. And these circumstances stress the urgency of developing wider rules of standing, wider rules of evidence, better reasonings regarding collective and societal harms, as well as complex and structural remedies. Thank you so much. Thanks for your attention.
Because in a way you show how it's very important to have a comprehensive pictures, not only a theoretical approach, but also a well-established, consolidated knowledge of the different case law in the different jurisdictions. Amazing, congratulations. And now is the time of the another speaker, Marco Antonio Simonelli. I hope it's here. I don't see any reaction. So in any case, now I will just finish to present even if it's not here. It's the University of Barcelona, PhD, Comparative Constitutional Law, University of Siena. But since it's not here, if you confirm here, Chair Joanna, there is we ended. Yes. So we can go with the final remark or after other. Okay. Yes, there is a clear Melissa that now plays a very important role, and I leave the floor to Joanna in order to introduce.
Yes. Dear Melissa. Dear Melissa, first of all, thank you for your attention, for your patience. Okay, now it's your time for your conclusion and also for the other conclusion. We are two very important colleagues that give us the conclusion. Just some words to Melissa Hamilton. Melissa is a professor of law and criminal justice, University of Surrey, UK. Melissa, in my opinion, has had the ability to combine, to join constitutional public law with criminal law. In fact, her studies are concentrated basically on 2 points: evaluating algorithm risk assessment and debating algorithm fairness. So, dear Melissa, we are waiting for your conclusion, and not more than 12 minutes. Okay?
Okay, can you hear me well?
Yes, very well.
All right. So thank you to Professor Domenico for putting together this really wonderful group of papers. It's just been fascinating. So the group of 8 papers which I'm commenting on here offer insightful, progressive, and useful suggestions on the topic of digital constitutionalism with considerations towards state sovereignty and the role of private invention. This is truly an international panel of experts drawing on legal and cultural mechanisms from various countries and legal collectives, such as India, France, Italy, the US, European Union, and Latin America. The papers concern what one author refers to as technological capitalism, while another uses the term surveillance capitalism. Both appear to include issues related to online speech, the online consumption of large amounts of private data, and online exchanges for goods and services. The authors jointly recognize that the regulation of technological or surveillance capitalism is being governed mostly by monolithic corporations and their own standards and processes. Fears expressed include draining power from state sovereignty, threatening democratic ideals, replacing statutory protections with weaker contractual terms, and otherwise undermining values in consumer privacy and safety. In terms of focusing on free speech, some companies, such as Facebook, have purportedly sought to address private free speech interests by creating their own policing mechanisms. There's some good to this in terms of corporate assumption of responsibility, as long as these authorities exercise sufficient power and independence from their profiteers. But there are also dangers in that private institutions can avoid the state's constitutional structure with their fundamental rights of adjudicating free speech as accomplished in the public sphere. One presentation notes specific concern with Facebook's so-called oversight committee being more hype about corporate duties than in reality actually operating as a robust auditor or adjudicatory mechanism. At least one paper points out that the digitization of speech has undermined state sovereignty by funneling public power into the hands of a few monopolistic corporations. A consequence is that the state's checks and balances are at risk to the potential infringement of illiberal regimes. This poses a danger to democracies and democratic ideals. The authors also envision dangers to the free market, where a few large monopolies can concentrate the market while excluding newcomers, or just limiting the contribution of new ideas and ways of thinking. These papers pretty consistently point out that the concentration of power within a few hands has gone largely unregulated for too long. Whatever values that may have been sought for governmental agencies, letting technology companies initially to run free have been enjoyed. The downsides to those freedoms have run out. The problems are not just about avoiding government intervention. Some authors also discuss issues when big tech becomes directly involved within governmental functions. One example given is the rise in private company use of artificial intelligence within governmental systems in terms of data processing and the digitization of governmental functions. While offering the benefits of efficiency, speed, and access to big data, a potential downside is the state abdicating its power and responsibilities in carrying out its governmental functions without ceding to the technology and in protecting individual interests in speech, privacy, and safety. The authors, both individually and collectively, call on the state, its officials, and its traditional machinery to step up to the challenge these few for-profit digital oligopolies pose, for example, Facebook, and to create strong regulatory regimes. One example posed is a new look toward how antitrust laws may be used as a tool to rein in overstepping corporations by breaking them up as necessary to reduce the ability of executives to improperly exploit their power. Nonetheless, traditional legal protections, processes, and structures may not be sufficient to the task. Another example envisions new forms of regulation aimed at reining in new digital marketplaces that consume private and governmental data in ways that profit the big companies at the expense of the public good. Suggestions include using the law to make these companies and their executives more accountable to private citizens and to governmental agencies. Some authors acknowledge the situation and the solution as not being necessarily dichotomous, in that the control and processes should not be created and wielded solely by government or solely by the big tech company apparatus. Instead, these authors anticipate a healthy public-private sharing and a view to the role of national, international, and transnational regimes. Indeed, one of the barriers acknowledged is that the digital space transcends traditional territorial borders and thus presents a challenge to the ability of any single or even small collection of nations to address the challenges observed. The presenters embrace these problems and offer interesting insights in potential new cross-border plans in what one author calls a hybridization of constitutional law. Another important theme in the group of papers is how the private companies have assumed more traditional state obligations, while the government may need to learn to be more entrepreneurial, although with a strong ethical and legal framework. Both private and state actors have a role to play in exploiting the advantages of technologies, of AI, and the digitization of information. Yet an important takeaway is that we still live in a human world with traditional values about what humans can and should expect in terms of individual rights and liberties. Indeed, one paper suggests perhaps a need for a new and novel set of constitutional principles to protect humans over the technology-driven machines. In the end, the collection of papers here engages in an important dialogue meant to inform interested parties around the world on these relevant issues, including policymakers, tech companies, experts in ethics, privacy advocates, and the public at large. It was a pleasure to participate in this important exchange between scholars from different countries, academic backgrounds, and offering various perspectives, albeit with some commonalities as I've tried to identify. Thank you for your time and attention, and this has just been a wonderful experience.
Cannot be commented by me, but I suppose by anyone. I want to ask to draw your attention on their capacity to take together institutional problem issues concerning institution, issues concerning fundamental rights, the difficult balance between sovereignty, new concept of sovereignty and power of private authority. Thanks, Melissa. And now, Oreste, you should present our.
Yes, with pleasure, because it's also a dear friend, Amnon Reichman. He is a professor at Haifa Law School, very well known in Israel and abroad, visiting professor at Berkeley, and many other things. Among those, I just would like to recall the circumstance that is co-chair of the, let's say, twin research group that I co-chair with Giovanna. In the sense that the first one with Giovanna is the Constitution in the Age of the Internet, whereas with Amnon, I co-chair and thanks for his support, the research group on algorithmic state, market and society. I think that it's absolutely plastically evident how these two topics are connected. This is why one of the successes, clearly I'm not partial, I'm not impartial of this workshop. Having said this, Amnon, please, the word is yours, and thank you very much for being here exactly for this workshop. We really appreciate the effort to go and back from Israel in 48 hours. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and an honor to be here. Indeed, as Oreste said, this is it's a journey. We started quite some time ago, and great. And so my concluding remarks begin with the observation of time, in the sense that we have canvassed the evolution or revolution of technology, and I think we have matured enough to ask ourselves some basic questions. And I think the papers we've heard all address various angles or aspects of these fundamental or basic questions. And I think the primary question that we should focus on is on this idea of the virtual. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the virtual, and then I'm going to say some things about the normative aspects of the virtual, and then just a couple of words about what's next, because we have to be practical, not just virtual, in the sense of the groundedness of our research. So the starting point that I want to suggest, and again, the idea of what is the virtual has been haunting us ever since the www has emerged, and even before the www, when we had gophers, people remember we had to type some addresses and go straight to this and that, and before DNS was integrated. So I want to suggest that the starting point for the conversation of this within law is the notion of jurisdiction. Now, I want to again situate jurisdiction in time. The emergence of the concept of jurisdiction is actually quite interesting. Where did it come from? How did it emerge? I have a different working group that deals with law and history to examine what is jurisdiction and how the concept of jurisdiction evolved through the ages. But now we view jurisdiction as consisting of 4 components. Any legal norm, and in fact any norm, has to have some relationship to space. It applies in a certain space. It was legislated or adjudicated vis-a-vis a certain space, vis-a-vis or by certain actors. There's a personal dimension to jurisdiction. A certain actor exercises a certain legal power or other normative power vis-a-vis other people or entities. So there is a personal dimension. There is the functional dimension with respect to what? We call it in Russian materia in law, but it doesn't matter. And then there is the notion of time. When? When does a law or a norm apply? And the question is whether the virtual is just another context or whether the virtual is indeed the 5th dimension. Because if we think about it theoretically, we are now in a stage where the human condition has been expanded. What is us? I look at my kids, I have kids. They experience the selves of their selves as extended or expanded into the virtual. If I tell them, okay, enough screen time, and people here who are parents, I think, could sympathize with a tear or without a tear about this losing battle of telling kids enough screen time. They look at me as if I amputated an arm because it's myself. I am there. You just told me that the color red no longer is part of my existence. You just removed a certain aspect of that who I am. And this is because the virtual connects. It is the point where one agency connects with others in a novel way. This is not just something, oh yeah, the law of the horse, there was once a horse, now there is internet, we just should apply this. An old debate. Some people remember that there was an old debate whether the internet should have new laws, and the idea was, well, we didn't have new laws with horses, now we should have new laws for the internet. That debate is long gone. It's a different thing, which I pose the question whether it's a dimension. And if it is a dimension, we should understand that the question is goes much deeper. We should realize that if there's a 5th dimension, then of course something should change with the law, but beyond that. Okay, so I'm just going to say some things very quickly about this dimension. So, of course, we know that it's a different, and I'm going to be very brief. Each of these can be expanded, and we don't have time to that. But it's a different kind of space because it's virtual. It does have a physical dimension, of course. There are servers somewhere, and if the servers are in Britain, there will be consequences because the Secret Service will be able to do some things with respect to these servers. And if the servers are in China, it makes a difference. But this physical dimension, it doesn't even, and there are bits, or bytes. There is communication of electrons or photons, depending how we construct the network. Of course, there's a physical, but that's what we're talking about. The code then becomes virtual because of our consciousness. And of course, it generates divides. This space also has divides, and people talked about the divides. There is the continental divide between the US approach that views innovation and the EU approach which views regulation and the idea that we should protect. It's a kind of a divide. And of course, we talked about the digital divide between the haves and the have-nots. Even within a single jurisdiction, in France, not all people are connected similarly to the virtual. And this is France, right? And there are other examples, of course. Time works differently. So we are all aware of the notion of, oh, it went viral. That's something new. It went viral is the time has been condensed, in socially speaking, in a new way. Similar to what happened with the telegraph, but the telegraph was point to point. Now you reach individuals. Radio was such, but radio was singular. We know this, but this is new. And it's eternal in the sense that it never forgets. It is always there. There's always a repository of what happened online. Question mark about that. In a weird way, it's also susceptible, very susceptible to technological evolutions, because if you rely on saving something on the hard drive and the technology changes, that's it, it's gone. So librarians have a huge issue now, how to preserve knowledge. They used to preserve knowledge through books that are there for, depending on the technology of the paper, for thousands of years or something. Now with this, 20, 30 years, this could be gone because we don't have the technology to access the data. Okay. The virtual actors behave differently. So we know that agency is located in a single person. We talk, but then we invented the corporate. This is why jurisdiction is important. We invented the corporate at a certain point in time to deal with the fact that people die, and in fact we needed a container to carry over risks when we developed the trade with China, because it took a long time and we needed to borrow money, so we invented the corporation, and now we have this idea of the corporate. But now we have entities online that are managed by different people, and it's the same entity, but the person behind the entity may change. So it's really something novel. And of course, the idea of corporate, we talked about the idea of the relationship between the corporal and the corporate is interesting, but the corporate elites and who are the corporates, what corporate stands for, and the emergence of, oh yeah, there were just these little kids in their garage in Silicon Valley, all of a sudden they're the new barons. We talked about that. Facts are virtualized. We need forensics to know what happened. We talked about the role of the prosecutor. You need digital forensics to know who said what to whom. All of a sudden, the relationship of bytes and expression is the actual bytes. That what is the expression? The code or the, so the facts themselves in the virtual domain. Something happens there, interestingly, and we have a new language. I don't have to send you to Reddit to understand how people speak. They speak differently. What was, with the intersection of sex talk in the way they speak in Reddit is just, from us, as an older person, like, what are they talking about? Yeah, this is how they speak. But also new languages, in the sense of, is it computer science language, legal language, sociology language that defines the domain. And that means that we have to learn new languages. And we have AI. AI tells us, explains to us, but predicts. The distribution of powers, we talked about it, I don't have time to go into that, but I want to note the complexity of the state. The state, we realize, is not just the monarch, the state. Various agencies are there. At all times, the state, we know the state is very complex. The state is, and I have another paper on that, the state is a user itself. The state uses Microsoft, the state uses Facebook, the state uses Twitter. So it's a user, it's a regulator, but it's also a super user because it has the capacity to develop technology itself as an actor, as a super user. So it puts the state in a weird position. And there are issues of how you move within this dimension, how you mobilize other people. Is it a space of liberation or domination and control? Tendencies to illiberalism because of the click bites. We hate, therefore we click. Echo chambering, all that happens there. And it's our job to understand that and to study that. Okay, I don't have time to talk about the normative. We talked a little bit about the crisis of legitimacy or legitimation. Habermas wrote an important book about the crisis of legitimation post-war. Now we experience a crisis of legitimation that talks about the source of the power, liberty, equality versus domination, and talked about this, and the notion of sovereignty, which deals with agency of the human, the agency of the agency, because we have lots of agencies, the agency of the state, the agency of the state to state. We have to address the idea of the legitimation. We talk about several responses to that, the idea that we have to care about human agency and fairness through the PART principles of participation, accountability, representation, and transparency. But we didn't talk enough about regulation by design. Several people mentioned that. Because this domain is virtual, we can construct the domain in a certain way that allows us, some people mentioned this, that allows us to ensure that some things at least are transparent, at least we can participate with respect to them, at least we can have some notion of what's going on, because the asymmetry now is just too much in the sense of what Google knows and what we know, and what Facebook knows and we know, and how they can manipulate behind the scenes. And it was mentioned by several, Lars mentioned it, others mentioned it. Literacy is important. Digital literacy is important, but we can, and people mentioned it here, we can talk about data maps and data flows and storage and fusion and analysis and use. And there's a debate about that. We shouldn't just say, oh, it's private. The private is itself a construction, a social construction. If you go outside, you don't see what is private and what is public. It's us. We construct it. And therefore, when we construct the virtual, we should be mindful for that. And the last thing is that it raises an issue of complex compliance, because you have to comply with so many difficult or different regimes in the EU and the US because of the transnational notion of the virtual. You have the question of a complex compliance of cyber protection and privacy protection and speech protection and governance and this. And we know that because we live in this world. The final point I want to make here, because my time is also running short and I want to allow some time for discussion, is a point that I think, following up on Lars's point on, and of course I'm a Romanian, so I have to disclose this, deliberation versus contestation. Do we view this domain as a domain or a dimension where we deliberate and exchange ideas, or do we view this domain as premised on contestation between systems, between market and politics and religion? Bureaucracy is a system, art is a system. Even morality could be considered a system. So if we see it as systems, we see it as an extension of a social space where systems collide and communicate Lumanianly, then of course there is contestation within each system according to the rules of the systems or the rules of discourse within the system and system to system. So the market wants to swallow. Of course the market will want to swallow, because this is what markets do. Once you're in the market, everything, we are in the market now, buying certain product or service that's called education or something, right? And the market wants to know, how can I put advertisements there so you will purchase more? I will be an agent of the market in a second when I will say what is next. But on the other hand, we're also part of science. Now, right here, we're science because we seem, at least we aspire to search for the truth, which is the logic of the system of science. So where we are and how the contestation works with respect to the virtual is a fascinating question. And of course, the law is there. There's no space outside the law. The law governs us. There are legal molecules all around us. So of course, the law would want to say, okay, I regulate anything. Just like religion would want to say, everything is religious around here. Even if you don't believe in God, that's a religious position, right? So we have to realize that and be aware of that as we address this new dimension. If it is a dimension, I think it is, but I'm putting it as a question mark. I'm concluding because my time is up. We haven't even talked about quantum. Quantum is coming. If you think this dimension is the virtual dimension is a challenge, wait until quantum comes. Winter is okay. So what's next? We have to establish the kind of network, keep establishing and keep developing the networks of scholars that realize that constitutional law should not just fully migrate to the virtual, but nonetheless cannot ignore the virtual in an integrative manner. This is what we do. We have a summer school coming in July at the EUI. We are thinking, together with Melissa and the two wonderful co-chairs, to have an edited volume of this event. If you're interested, be in touch with us. We'll talk with Giovanni, with Eric Longo, who couldn't be here. Eric Longo is also a co-director of our group. Did a wonderful job, should be recognized for all his hard work. So we will consider this. And if you have any ideas of how to establish small workshops on different high theoretical, I went on purpose to the abstract. Some people talked about the minute details of how you use data profiling. We should connect them. These are our challenges, and I have concluded. Thank you very much. And I open now, or I transfer the floor to you to open up the floor for comments, discussions, ideas, until lunch comes.
I suppose it was before. Please.
One President from Mexico.
Yes.
Just a short comment, because I think, and I'm concerned because in some presentations I think that the private actor, the platform, is seen as something evil. Like, okay, this is the bad guys that we have to regulate, and we have to control. And for sure, when we think about Google, Facebook, the big ones, we can agree on that topic. But at some point, how can we, or how can the state decide to give incentives to these private actors to help the state? Because in the end, we need them because of the time that you were talking before. Yeah, we know that we need quick responses, and when we need them to auto-regulate or to do something that the state did in the past. And I don't know, in many of the presentations, I saw that the idea of the ego was
So I fully take up your point. I mentioned briefly in my conclusion, but it's a full. What is the regulatory attitude? And some people mentioned the command and control notion versus private regulation, but each reason you have co-regulation. And then the question becomes, when you co-regulate, with respect to what do you co-regulate, and how to design together without being captured. Because the temptation of being captured by Google is sense. But you're right, the US approach is innovation. Let's give them and we will all enjoy the new wonderful horizon. But the European approach is, but it's true. It's a question of regulatory attitudes. Perfect. That's even of itself. That's a big. How? With respect to which do we adopt command and control, or self-regulation, or co-regulation? Within co-regulation, there's some way. Thank you for that.
It's better if you have a question, preferable question, but here, so Melissa can listen to us. Do you have a question?
Yes.
Yes, come here.
If you can please come here.
So Viola Schmidt from Germany, Technical University of Darmstadt. First question, do you share the slides of this?
We could.
I would love to, because I've been belittled for 10 years, always writing about the fifth dimension of cyberspace and Einstein's relativity theory, and so I love this. The next point, I'm so surprised that even that you didn't focus on the AI high-level expert group of set up by the European Commission, and they say that there should be a framework for an AI-driven world that is fully aligned with fundamental rights. And the point I want to make is they have a new idea about law. They say it has to be lawful and robust. And robustness is what we have to discuss facing quantum and post-quantum cryptography. So this
technical dimension of robustness is also very important. Right.
So this is what I would like to add.
Yes, it's a very interesting. This is a question we should think about, and I think it deserves an answer. The question is why there was not a specific focus on the high-level expert group. The first answer would be because this was in a way, this is now a little bit outdated. In which sense? In the sense that that was a kind of declaration of intent that is not at all binding, and then this was transformed, shifted in a legislative act, the AI proposal of last year. And this is something totally different, because this would deserve another chapter, because exactly the principle that you evoked, they are a little bit now not anymore in the center, but in the corner in the legislation. What does it mean this from a policy making point of view? That the shift from the soft law to hard law I would say implies more compromise with regard to the fast ambitions. And if you look at the AI proposal act, you will not find anymore that human in the loop that is obsessed quoted in the high-level expert group report, but you will see another definition that is called oversight board that is completely different, because it's not anymore human in the loop, but human supervision. This would be my answer.
We agree to disagree, because I'm asked to leave the podium, and I would make the point that the AI draft
it should be
unlawful.
It's unlawful, yes.
It should be a debate. Question and answer, okay? Not other speech. Question, answer. If you no. If they have a question and also the answer of the speaker or third parties. Come here. No question? We can close.
Now you're intimidated.
No, it's no question. We can close.
Maybe sometimes it will be a question combined with a comment. It's difficult, but yes, the idea is to try to have an interaction between the speakers.
Interaction. A lot of brilliant idea, a lot of challenging idea. Nothing. Also each other. Nothing. Laura, no question.
Yes.
If you can please
No. It's here. You can just raise, stand up, and it's fine. No, that's
otherwise
fine. You're not here. That's a physical and a virtual.
I guess my question was not explicit enough, and it was also due to time constraints. I'm using I feel that I'm preaching to the choir, because most of the percent share that the area account, which actually means that private platforms are going to embed constitutional values in their practice. So it's not that they're like the bad guys, but we need channels to embed those constitutional values in how they moderate content. Talking only about social media. So I guess it's not that they're the bad guys, but we do need to change their culture, because now they are only following the business model, right? So it's a collaboration, and obviously co-regulation is a factor.
Thanks for your question.
Thank you. So I have a question actually for Lars. Thank you so much for your presentation. So at a certain point you said fundamental rights can be used as limitations for the private legal order. So I just wanted to ask you if you could elaborate more on kind of like which fundamental rights are you referring to? If you have an idea, I think that this was one of the dilemmas that was presented. And if you think that actually these non-state actors can understand sort of like how fundamental rights norms are phrased today, because of course they usually address the state actors. Do you think that they have the capacity to sort of like self-incorporate these values, or we need a sort of like a further process of translation?
Just a quick follow-up on that. You mentioned rights as limitations, at least from the perspective of the corporations. Rights are actually, they view themselves as extending rights, extending speech, equalizing the playing field, because everybody can participate, etc. So whether it's a limit or whether it's a positive extension.
Or really a possibility. Do it for us.
I think this question also connects well to what you just said in the beginning. Do we just regard these new transnational regimes as threats, you know? And that's why I said I would regard fundamental rights here as both foundation and limitation of those, you know, new regimes. So on the one hand, they are protected by fundamental rights, especially freedom of speech, freedom of information. So it depends on the regime you're talking about. Whether you're talking about, you know, internet, so the social networks, sports law, or whatever you have in the transnational world. So on the one hand, foundations, so they are protected by freedom of speech, of information, because they open up communication. That's also a democratic discourse. On the other hand, limitation in the sense that opposing liberties should be protected. This would be so freedom of speech on the other direction, and also equal participation once they acquire a monopoly position in regulating a certain sector that is relevant to fundamental.
Thank you. Just a comment, follow up very shortly about this idea, because I like very much, and it's not the case that this kind of German scholar, the idea to take very seriously the application of fundamental rights, because it was created at the end of the 50s by German courts. But what I would like to add is that the European Court of Justice has to decide if this horizontal application is really a clear weapon, or it's just you know, fragmented solution, because sometimes applies horizontally few rights, sometimes denies the horizontal dimension. Sometimes it applies even in I would say hidden way, like Article 7 and 8 in Spain. So this should be a clarification from case law, otherwise the principle of legal certainty might be harmed. Apologize for the interruption, please.
Thank you very much, sir. I'd like to
May I just add a thing? I agree with this horizontal, but I think that there is a great problem that also yesterday in another workshop was posed. The constitutional duties, must the constitutional duty of can the constitution be exposed and extended to private power? In addition to the horizontal effect, in addition. Other questions?
Just two comments to that. The first question was by from Mexico. Actually, the money itself is not the root of the evil, but the amount of love you give to it. Having said that, there is no absolute right in the world, neither in a democratic society who is governed by the rule of law. But we have to answer what is the content of the rule of law. Who is serving to? Whose interests? The leaders have talked about capitalism and how we can measure and define dignity. So having said that, I'd like to underline that we have to protect this core principle, which is everywhere, either in China, Russia, Chicago, Haifa, wherever, Brazil, in Mexico City, which is the human dignity. So when we look at for the criminal law, we have this kind of perception. If men, we have created a culprit, why don't we apply the disregard doctrine in face of the constitutional fundamental law protecting all of us? This is metaphor. The question is who and when and how and who you choose as a political decision. Either you vanish with the vulnerable economic people, because internet also is a fundamental right. We should have discussed it. Two colleagues of ours discussed it, and we have to say clearly what kind of society we want. Thank you very much.
Please.
Yes, Meinrad Schröder, University of Passau in Germany. Yesterday I've been talking in the other workshop you just mentioned about the horizontal effect. I think I totally agree with you that it's a problem with legal certainty with the horizontal effect, not only where it applies and where it doesn't apply, but also with regard to what is the outcome, because the balancing is always sort of unforeseeable. But in my view, it's because the aspect of time was just mentioned. It's mainly an involvement, because now we just have lots of general clauses we try to apply to these new phenomena, and at some point we realize that it's not enough anymore. So there is more specific statute law, like for example the DSA or something like that, which might still need some balancing, but then we don't need this discussion about horizontal effect to that extent anymore. So in my view, it's also evolving of the law, which is probably slightly delayed in comparison to the development of technology, but then it should be delayed because, as it was mentioned, the technology companies, they are not just enemies. They also have positive effects, and there is no justification for just blocking any innovation without knowing.
How to do it is challenge. Now there is a directive. I just want to note, now there is an ongoing directive on label, and the label on a platform, and so also the algorithm with the platform. And the problems I discussed with syndicate in Italy on this problem. So the question was that the syndicate, trade unions have no power to take part in the administrative procedure that conducted to the algorithm act, but they have no power in the rulemaking that will design the algorithm. So they are out. Who wants to answer that?
I would like just to share an experience in Brazil. There is this National Customers Council for telecommunications. So the council, which is comprising the possibility to control and following the regulations and the rules, the rule making and the procedure making of the telecommunication services, is shared formed by civilians and for government nominated people. So that's how us civilians, we can integrate in the process of participate and get knowledge about what's going on, what are the architecture, institutional architecture of the services.
Okay, she says. Any more? Before I have, sorry, before I
Yeah, three very short interventions. First of all, I'm glad that you will be European integration public policy in Europe. And I'm the chair of the Scientific Committee of the Fundamental Rights Agency in the EU. So first of all, thank you very much for the participation and the excellent presentations of the speakers, and particularly the powerful presentations of the doctors. A second announcement, the Fundamental Rights Agency of the European Union has done important pioneering work in this area, and there are a number of publications on business and human rights, on artificial intelligence, on text recognition, on algorithmic discrimination, which is downloaded freely from its website. So please visit the website and download the publications. And the third observation or question is this. I think one concept and practice that was not mentioned today was corruption. And I think we mentioned state captured by private business, but corruption in the private sector, corruption in the public sector, and digital surveillance. I was very much happy to see a number of issues being explored, in the issue of corruption, in relation to businesses and human rights and state relations to the public sector, the private sector, all will be explored.
In my paper, when it's come up with the final version, I proposed the corruption and some kind of criminality in transnational criminality.
Please.
Just quickly to Laura's intervention, so the role of civil society, I think we have to extend the picture even further. So in this process in this horizontal process of recognition and contestation that Anon also mentioned, we have a multiplicity of actors. And what is interesting is that none of them has the last word. So we have no hierarchy. Even a single state recedes to a representative of particular interests in this transnational constellation. And so we have, nation state intervening, their legislators, the European Union with the Digital Markets and Services Act, the courts, both national, international, and transnational. And so we have a horizontal process of contestation and deliberation. This is perhaps a
if it's not captured.
If it's
If it isn't captured.
Well, that's it. Yeah. So formally, we have no hierarchy, and the question is, what is underneath? So
what's the power underneath? The power structure underneath.
Someone else, or we can close? Okay. So, bye-bye.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, thanks for your effort, for your work, and also for us.
Bye bye, Melissa. Bye. Now we've closed. Bye. I write you.
Our colleague over there who's
I write you. Bye, Melissa.
Who's helping us.